Welcome to this lesson. So in the last lessons, we were looking at the grid template rows properties, and we looked at how to create multiple rows with different heights and everything. And in this lesson, let's look at another property that's related to rows. So most times you won't want to mention the number of rows that you want to create, but you'll definitely need to mention the heights of the rows that are automatically created based on the elements that you create inside a grid container. If you remember the lessons where we covered the column property, you know that even if you remove this grid template rows property, you'll still get the number of rows automatically created based on the number of columns we create and the number of grid items we have. So you don't actually have to create your rows every time, but it's much better to actually have your heights mentioned, okay? So that you can mention the height of each of these rows. All right, so in order to just set the height of the rows and not the number of the rows, you can use the grid auto rows property. So this is that property, grid auto rows. So you can use this property to set the height. Similar to the other properties, you can give pixel values, or you can give percentage values, or you can give fraction values. Okay, so if I give 1fr in here, that means that all the rows have one fraction in height, that is 1 unit of height, which actually means that we are dividing this height equally among all the rows. Okay, perfect. Or you can give a proper pixel value, let's say 200 pixels. And let's see what happens now. And let me remove this height in here because it's going to exceed the 480 pixels in height. So there you go. Do you see that? So each of the row has 200 pixels in height automatically created. But if you want to specify different heights, you would have to go back to the grid template rows property, because with that you can actually list out the height for each of the row that you create. So this is just to specify an overall height of all the rows. Now I want to show you what happens when you add text to these elements. So what if the size of the text exceeds the height of the elements? So let's just add some arbitrary text inside this. Make it maybe row and right. Alright, so we have some text in here, and let's remove all the row values in here. Okay, so I'm just going to show you what happens when you don't have a proper value mentioned. Okay, so there you go. Do you see that? Do you see what happens now? You have the usual value, the usual padding value, and the height that is related to the padding value for the other two rows. But for the first row where we added all of these text, you have an increased height. It automatically increases in height. But the thing is, it does not just increase one of the columns, it actually increases all of the columns. Okay, so that is the point. So it doesn't look very good because the other rows look much smaller in comparison. Do you see here? These look very, very small. This looks entirely too big, so it doesn't actually look like a uniform website. So to circumvent that, we can use the auto rows property. That is the grid auto rows property that I just covered, and you can give a value that is a pixel value for all of these rows. So let's look at that. Great. So everything looks much better now, but the thing is, the text is cut off because it's more than 200 pixels in height, so the text is cut off in the second element. So that isn't what we want, because that entirely defeats the purpose of a website that displays information. Am I right? So we want a solution where we can specify a fixed width of the rows as long as the text does not exceed it. But if it does exceed the specified height, then the row needs to elongate to accommodate automatically. Okay, so it just needs to elongate a little bit further so that it accommodates, but the other rows will have a decent enough width so that it does not look abnormal. Right, in order to do that, we are going to use the min-max function and specify a particular uniform height. So we're going to use the minimax. So this function, we're going to use this, and we're going to specify a uniform height. There is a minimum height. So this is the minimum height as long as the text does not exceed. But if it does exceed, it has to automatically elongate to take up the height of that text. So this min-max function lets us have best of both worlds. So there you go. Do you see that? So this had to elongate a couple more pixels to take up the entire width, and there's also padding included inside this, and the others have their 200 pixels in height. You don't actually have to do this with just grid auto rows. You can actually do that in grid template rows as well. For example, let me create 3 pixels, and in here, instead of giving the height of your rows, you can use min max and say that all of these has to have 200 pixels in height, but if the text exceeds, it can be automatically elongated. See? Perfect. It's still the same. So this is how you can play around with your row values, and this is how you can use the min-max value to make your text look much better and your website look much better as well. So I'll see you in the next lesson. Thank you.